boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us today the George C. Dix Professor in Constitutional Law at Northwestern University. He's the author of Accelerating Democracy, published by Princeton University Press, the co-author of Originalism and the Good Constitution, published by Harvard University Press. He's a graduate of Harvard, Balliol at Oxford colleges, and he's a graduate of Harvard Law School. He's also a contributor to Law and Liberty Foundation, which is a classical liberal foundation. I want to introduce to you today John O. McGinnis. John, welcome to the show.
Delighted to be here.
I'm glad to have you because I want to talk with you today about your recent article with Law and Liberty called Poetic Truths Are Everywhere. And in that article, you were comparing mainly two different films or series of films. For one case, The Crown, which is very popular. I've watched it myself, compared to an independent film called What Killed Michael Brown. What made you compare those two?
Well, I thought they were an interesting contrast in two respects. One, as you point out, The Crown was extremely popular. It was backed by one of our very large streaming companies, Netflix.
Yes.
And must have millions of watchers. The other was, as you say, an independent film, but also one that had great trouble even appearing on Amazon because it was controversial. So one surprise was that you might think that what makes something controversial is when it recounts a historical event is
Right.
that facts are demonstrably incorrect. But it was The Crown that had demonstrably and indeed consciously false facts in it, whereas the Who Killed Michael Brown was in part, a careful reconstruction of the killing of Michael Brown in the place near St. Louis that caused a great deal of controversy, and reconstruction based on a Department of Justice report.
Right.
So it was rather bizarre that one's traducing of the facts, The Crown, got very little comment at all, and the other's faithfulness to the facts seemed to get it almost not a hearing. So that's the first contrast.
Right.
The other, I think, is that it showed that actually, I thought this is a very important point, that the Shelby Steele, the narrator of and I think the writer of the film Who Killed Michael Brown, said, well, Who Killed Michael Brown really shows that a lot of people don't live by the facts in the modern world, that they really, the crucial aspect and why people think falsely and claim falsely that Michael Brown was murdered by a police officer rather than killed by a police officer in self-defense, is that fits into their narrative of the world. And the Department of Justice comment and report can't shake that narrative, no matter how false it is, because that's the narrative by which the whole group, Black Lives Matter, whole group of left-wing students live. That struck me as very forcible, was, as I point out in the article, at my law school, we have, not put up by the students, put up by the administration, a photograph of a demonstration where everyone has their hands up, don't shoot, which was the myth perpetrated by people who said that Michael Brown was killed by the police unjustly. In other words, he was trying to surrender and was killed in cold blood,
Right.
which the report completely undermined. And yet that picture remains up at my law school, which a place you would think would be dedicated actually
to facts.
the truth. Really, the truth in
Right.
the criminal justice system, which you might think
Wow.
the whole point of it is that is at least a central point of it is that it is an engine for getting the truth. So
Uh,
that's what's extremely troubling. On the other hand, the crown also feeds into a series of myths. Myths I largely focused. I think there's some myths about the royal family. I'm less interested in the royal family than in politics.
yeah.
A myth about Margaret Thatcher. Myth makes up things about Margaret Thatcher, including the outrageous claim that she tried to get the Queen to dissolve Parliament so she could retain power
Yeah.
rather than be ousted as head of the Conservative Party. It's certainly it's utterly fabricated. And then they
Right.
fabricate an incident. They use an incident to fabricate something about Margaret Thatcher. There was a man who did, in fact, get into the Queen's bedroom,
Hmm.
but in the Crown, they use it to allow him, and they portray him sympathetically, again, contrary to the facts. And he gives a long speech against what Thatcher is doing, clearly a kind of mouthpiece of the people who do this
Right.
film.
Yes.
And if that's less surprising, I mean, always people in whatever the equivalent of Hollywood in Britain is, I'm sure, are very left wing, just as they are in the United States.
Yes.
And so they just want to make the myth of all these terrible things about Thatcher that are just demonstrably false. So that's the important contrast I want to draw in the films. One that we seem to have our intelligentsia and our screamers seem to have problems with the facts, given that it was hard even to get the Michael Brown film on. But more generally, the point is that people live by these myths. These they need to make up facts to make sure that the myths continue and are broadcast to the world.
Now I've seen the episode of The Crown where it shows that episode where the guy breaks into the Queen's palace and has this conversation with her, and how it portrays Thatcher. I watched a few how they portrayed Thatcher, and I was like, wow, they are really portraying her in a most grotesque, characterized version they could do of her. They made her very unflattering. I think almost on purpose. And then, like you said, they use these other events that are factual, but as you said, they then use that as like a stepping stool to kind of insert what they really want to put out there, not just display what has taken place.
But I think that's an excellent way. I mean, I do point out that a lot of it is they actually take verbatim speeches. The
Hmm.
speech, for instance, of Geoffrey Howe, who resigns and precipitates Thatcher's downfall, which is largely taken verbatim, and
Yes.
that gives it a kind of verisimilitude to do things that are absolutely false. For instance, it's the case, I think, that this man who got into the Queen's bedroom didn't have a chance to say anything to the Queen because the Queen quite sensibly immediately left her bedroom,
Right. Yeah.
showing a kind of common sense even in royalty. That's absolutely the way they did it. So it's very hard for people who are not historians of the time to sift out what's false and what is true. And so I think that makes it a little different from something that is a historical novel,
Hmm.
which actually generally takes the big facts of the time as true and inserts some characters
Right.
who you follow. The main
Right.
characters in The Crown are absolutely the important players of the time. The the people in the royal family and people like Thatcher. And I think you're absolutely right about. I don't make much of this in the review. I think there's one point I think you bring out nicely, which is that one other aspect is I think a lot of the other actors, I think, really play their characters with a kind of realism, and Gillian Anderson, who's playing Thatcher, really, I think, does descend into caricature.
Yeah.
That I
Oh,
think
wow.
is a conscious decision. Not
Yeah.
surprisingly, I think at the time Gillian Anderson is the girlfriend of the director, so I think it is a very conscious
Wow.
uh, decision on their
That says a
part.
lot. Yeah.
Um,
Goodness. But some of the things you bring up in the article about Thatcher, I think, are important to consider in light of how they portrayed her in the film The Crown. Because it's all. I'm just going to say it's blatant lies. They're probably going to say, well, it's just a form of expressing, blah blah blah, whatever. But it, like you talk about the lines, and I remember seeing this in the series. They have these long lines of unemployed people, um, as living on the dole, as they would say over there in the UK, right? And he's trying to get his stuff, and they're trying to present this bad economic condition that apparently Thatcher had somehow created over her long tenure. But the absolute truth is that existed prior to her, and she actually helped turn the economy around by doing away with a lot of the leftist policies that were ruining the country, right?
that's absolutely true, and I can speak directly to that. I was in England at Oxford. You mentioned that I went to
Yes.
Balliol College, Oxford, at the time Thatcher was elected. So I was there before Thatcher was elected,
Hmm.
and at least briefly after Thatcher was elected. And the conditions in Britain were terrible
Yes.
when Thatcher was elected. That's in no small reason she was elected. There was what's famously called the winter of discontent
Yes.
in England. Now, it is true that unemployment went up for a bit of time and then went radically down
Hmm.
by the time during the time that this series portrays, which they go to Thatcher's resignation, and that is never not only not emphasized, it's never even mentioned. You would have the impression reading the series that it
Yeah.
represented the immiseration and of Great Britain, and also the series never seems to reflect about Thatcher's subsequent re-elections,
Yes.
and she leaves, as the longest serving, which they also don't do, a longest
Mhm.
serving prime minister in I think over 100 years in Britain. The
Wow.
last point, which actually goes to the last point, they show also historically the Queen giving her the highest civilian award, which is called the Order of Merit, when
Mhm.
she leaves office. She got it some time later, but the Queen just gives it to her because she was a woman. And
Right.
that's, of course, just completely false. The only other post war prime minister to get the Order of Merit was Clement Attlee. And those, I think any historian would say, are the two most important post-war prime ministers, and they had nothing to do with their gender, but
Right.
because they really changed the country. The Clement Attlee, we brought in the welfare state, and Thatcher, who brings in and really cuts back on the welfare state and really makes sure that Britain is again a market economy. That is again a way of falsifying Thatcher. The only good thing about Thatcher turns out that she was a woman, and
Right.
that's just again a caricature of her
Yeah.
regime.
Well, and as you put it, a woman who stood up to conservative men. That was the important connection that they
Right,
wanted to
right.
emphasize.
Now there is some truth, and again, that again is false. She did. There's a great biography of Thatcher
Mhm.
by Moore, and it does point out that there's great tensions between Thatcher and the party, which is largely made up of men. I think it's less the focus should be on men, but it's really a very much an old school group of people who really aren't too interested in ideas. They're just interested in power. And
Right.
that's quite an interesting contrast to draw, because Thatcher is very interested in implementing a set of ideas. That
Mhm.
would actually be some truth to reality. The reason she succeeded was she was a much more of an ideas prime minister than the Conservative Party has been generally comfortable with. That's a
Right.
fascinating matter to explore, not her gender.
That's right, exactly. Because I mean, she served what, over 10 years, which is amazing in that system, which can remove you when it
Yes.
feels like it, right? I mean, she served over 10 years. Um, she handled the Falklands invasion, I think, very well. When everyone else wanted to run away, flee, and not deal with it, she dealt with it. She turned the economy around in her country. She's propelled it even to where it is now, I think, in a lot of ways, from where it could have went into ruin. And all they show of her in The Crown is she's like this power hungry woman who's a bully with the Falklands War kind of thing. They give it like a notion. She has to have her parade, and then they like fast forward to the end where apparently it's her downfall and everybody's tired of her, and they ignore all of her accomplishments in between. But like you said, at the end, she gets this award from the Queen, not because of any achievement, but because she was a woman who stood up to conservative men. And I would, and maybe you can verify this for me. Conservatives in England are not exactly like conservatives in America. Is that true?
That's true.
I mean,
That is
there's some.
absolutely true. Conservatives
Mhm,
in England, at least particularly before Thatcher, and even maybe it's returning
mhm.
to it, really were people who were reveled in the fact that they really didn't have many ideas. And that the famous comment by the Earl of the Marquis of Salisbury, who was a longtime prime minister in the beginning, late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, said they regarded themselves as kind of the policemen of society. They were just the
Uh-huh.
brakes on crazy left wing ideas. That's what he said. My function is no greater than the policeman who prevents society from getting out of control.
Mhm.
But and so she is a brake on that. She is in some ways also brings in much more liberal ideas in the 19th century idea of liberalism, the
Mhm. Yes.
centrality of the free market. And so
Yes.
that what makes her different. Certainly, I think American conservative has at least been different in that respect. The free market has been much more central uh, to American conservatives and to the Republican Party,
Mhm.
at least until now. I'm less certain how strong the free market is to the Republican Party of today, when
Right.
the outgoing president tried to increase, and with the support of some people in his party, the distribution of money, not to people who were unemployed, but just people who had a certain income. That struck me as a big break with the Republican Party that I recognize. So there may be some changes happening today. I mean, no party is static; it changes, and
Right.
Thatcher has made the Conservative Party a much more market-oriented party, and it remains so today, although not with quite the same vigor that Margaret Thatcher had made it.
Right. Sure. Well, you've even mentioned um, that when Tony Blair came on the scene, him and the Labor Party, who were very left through England's history, had to revamp a lot of their party platforms, or they weren't going to keep power. Right.
That's right. Well, and that is the great tribute. The English have a expression about politicians who make the weather, which I think is a wonderful expression,
Hmm.
because it shows that there are some politicians who change things and everyone reacts to them.
Yes.
And Thatcher was such a politician. And the great success of a politician isn't actually just changing your own party. That's a hard, no
That's
mean
tough.
feat.
Yeah.
But then if you change your opposition,
Yes.
that is a real measure of success. And she transformed the Labor Party again, at least for many, many years until Corbyn was elected. He was a return to essentially a socialist party. And I'm not quite sure where the Labor Party will be today, but at least for around 20 years, she transformed the other party, and so that is a great achievement of Thatcher's.
And yet, for all that, she's just given a partial mention in The Crown for getting this prestigious medal, which only so many people in the world are ever going to get by the Queen herself. And it's just because she's a woman.
That's right. It's really, and of course, that's not surprising. That's another one of our myths today, which is
Hmm.
we look at everything through gender and race, and so
Right.
that's the way our. Not surprising who this director is. Morgan looks at the world, and so it fits in with the rating myths. No, the myths that we have on campus. I mean, it's just hard to over describe the way our college campuses see everything through these myths. I am at a school called Northwestern University, very highly ranked university in the United States. I think it was 10th or so.
Hmm.
And everyone hired now in the history department looks at history through race, gender, or colonialism.
Right.
And so that's also an excellent example of, I think, a kind of falsifying narrative that now our universities are perpetuating.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Is there like an opposite group that's emphasizing facts? Are they making headway? Do students just ignore it? Are they? Is there like a fight over it, or how's it going?
There are fights over it. I mean, there are fights over it, but it's very hard because what I and here I guess goes to another aspect of my review, which I just hit at the end. And one reason I think these overarching narratives now happen is that religion, I think, has declined in the last 100 years ago, and that really was a kind of narrative, transcendental narrative, in which people fit their view of the world. I think people, as I grow older, I think people kind of need myths, and I'm cautious about what I mean by that, but they need some overarching narrative
Yeah.
to give meaning to their lives. And now that
Right.
religion has declined, there are these other myths, and we're very much. It's young people, I think, need them more than almost anyone, and that's very much apparent at our universities. At one point, universities, Oxford and Cambridge,
Hmm.
were self-consciously Christian universities. Indeed, you had
Right.
to be a Don to agree to what we call the 39 Articles, which were essentially the core aspects of the Anglican Church. Now, of course, they're not religious in that sense, but they're religious in another sense. Everyone has to sign up to the ideology of diversity and inclusion.
Hmm.
And that is as clear an ideology as any religious sense. It makes all sorts of claims about the absolute equality in every respect of different groups, and the idea that some groups have been subordinated, remain subordinated, as a whole as a whole theology, and that's at the center of many of our great universities today. And it just cannot be overemphasized about what that is doing to our universities and to our society as a whole. It is a kind of straitjacket that is being put on the free exchange of ideas. And we see it just time and time again at my law school and particularly at the Northwestern University.
A straitjacket. That's a really good illustration. But with that, then let's bounce to this other film, "What Killed Michael Brown." Now, this is more of a is it more of a documentary type
Yes, that is a
film?
documentary. It's a documentary plus commentary. I mean,
Okay, gotcha.
it's very clear that he gives them in the beginning. He based on the witnesses who testified for the Department of Justice, he gives a clear timeline of what happened in this case. Michael Brown seemed to have stolen some things from a kind of tobacco shop
Mm,
and then
right.
walked along in the middle of the street. The officer tried to stop him, and then he charged the officer, and first of all tried to get this gun, and then went away, and then charged him, and that's how the shooting took place. So there's a clear, meticulous reconstruction of the facts. And then there's a greater commentary on, well, what's caused this? And
Mhm.
in that, Steele is a kind of neoconservative, suggests that what's caused it is the victimology, the
Right.
sense that people are a victim that is given by the left. And so I want to be clear that Michael Brown offers commentary, but unlike the Crown, it's very clear what's commentary and what's facts, right? We have a clear rendition, and then we try to say, well, why does this happen? And he's obviously giving his opinions about why it happened. Certainly, opinions based on
Mhm.
facts, but it's a commentary. So that makes it certainly different. What I want to give Shelby Steele credit for is he, as you correctly note, my essay is entitled "Poetic Truths Are Everywhere." It's
Mhm.
uh, Shelby Steele who uses the term poetic truths.
Mhm.
He says that uh, Michael Brown, the death of Michael Brown, was a kind of poetic truth. The poetic truth there was that he was killed by the police unjustly, and no matter what amount of facts were put out, that poetic truth is what remained a key for many people to understand his death, and has been the propelling narrative around which his death is used to illustrate. You know, the racism of the country, the relentless police brutality. These are, I think, are the narratives that go on, and no facts, no real facts, no real truths
Right.
can actually undermine the poetic truth, and that's, I think, an overarching point of his film.
Right. I'm not a poetic literature master by any means, but I would understand poetic truths is you don't. Everyone, I think, pre-understands the facts ahead of time when you use poetic truths. And so when you allude to things and deviate from things, it's not like you're creating a new set of paradigms. You're using other things that may not be true, but it's hinting at what's actually true that everyone
Right.
knows is true, right?
Right. So I think that's a nice point, and I think the uh, one of the burdens of my piece is to say that and I think one of the points that Steele is making, at least implicitly, at least I would say he's making, is the concern about our society is that we don't separate out our poetry from our facts.
Mhm.
And that's the real danger, because on the one hand, we need to make social policy based on facts. And we make it based
Mhm.
on things that are untrue, we're
Right.
going to get worse outputs. And of course, we've seen it in many ways uh, across the nation, right? To say that the central issue of crime and policing in our society is that minorities are killed unjustly by the police, and to gear up our structure of policing, to defund the police, to restrain the police in various ways based on that facts, is just on a falsehood. And what happens when we base it on that is we get higher rates of crime, and sadly, many more minorities dying.
Mhm.
So it's the making social policy based on these poetic truths is not poetry; it's danger, and I think we saw that across the country, and we may continue to see it. It's one
Right.
of my great concerns about the incoming administration is that they may well base their criminal justice policy on a set
Mhm.
of poetic truths that are false.
It's almost like an like an aversion to facts, like an absolute refusal to even consider like I've already determined what's going to be true, and everything must bend to that. Not this is true, I must bend to it.
That's right. No, well, that's right. I mean, you might say that, and what worries me about our society, let me just step back for a moment, is I think we had a lot of these maybe less virulent ways in the 1960s about what are the causes of crime and poverty. And we had
Right.
all these programs that were to address them. And then a group of people coming out with magazines like The Public Interest, Irving Kristol, Glazer, a whole set of what are called neoconservatives, pointed out that, well, these weren't really the facts, and the policies actually exacerbated
Right.
the problems that they sought to solve. I see we're in for another aspect of that because it's the same problem.
Mm.
The factual underpinnings of these policies were false. They were kind of romantic in the 60s. And today, I think they're less romantic. They're just angry. That one of the things that I think is interesting, the difference in the 60s had a kind of romantic, well, we could just change these things.
Yeah.
Society
Yeah.
would be, just beautiful. Now, I
Right.
think the idea is that society is just irredeemably evil, and we really have to hit it with a two by
Right.
four, and
Right.
things will at least be somewhat tolerable. Well, it's just going to get worse, and I think we're in a very dangerous place now.
I will go ahead and quote something from your article that you wrote. You wrote, the Crown's blend of fact and conscious inversions of truth underscores the danger that what is curated on the screen will increasingly substitute for what occurs in the world. Now, I have personally witnessed that with my own eyes in many a conversation because people will use movies to back up what they say. And sometimes it's movies that aren't even based on any, that's like science fiction movies sometimes, but it kind of portrays the reality they favor. And the movie is used as some kind of, well, there you go. That's how it works. And I'm like, it's not, there's no facts in the movies. And that one's science fiction. And what are you talking about? Uh, do you see this as a horrendous trend where basically our screens are just used mainly to control thought and not to discover truth?
Well, I think that this is, I think, a subject that I may be taking up in more essays this
Mm,
year.
yeah.
I do think it's interesting that we've moved to a society where, because people move from screen to screen, there may be a greater divorce than there ever has been before between the reality of the world and the reality that populates their mind, which may be a kind of fictional idea. My impression is that there's just a lot of fiction out there that people live. We're a very wealthy society,
Mhm.
and that may actually allow people to indulge in living in a kind of world of fantasy. And I want to be clear, I don't exempt people on the right from it. I mean, I myself think it's a fantasy that Donald Trump, the presidency was stolen from Donald Trump. I think that there may well have been some problems in the election, but he lost the election, and there are a whole group of people who just can't accept that reality. And I see what's going to happen on January 6th when they're going to object to it, which I think Biden will, of course, become president. It's just a extension of living out a kind of fantasy world, and yet it's sort of ultimately maybe rather destabilizing because what we have, and I think you alluded to, we have uh, a sense in which what unites us is a kind of reality, a kind of shared um, factuality, for want of a better word, from which we base our society. And if we really don't even agree on that, we may have even greater and greater divisions. And so that sort of in the basis of my review is deeply within my review is a disquiet about that. Is that I think exactly what you suggest is that we seem to be living in a greater world of fantasy. Can we do that? I mean, maybe we can. We have I mean, there's no doubt, right? One way of thinking about
Right.
the world, if we step back, is at one point, Hobbes said, well, what you need to have to keep society together is an absolute ruler. That's what
Mhm.
that was Hobbes's idea in Leviathan.
Yeah.
And we've shown that's not really true. We can have a democratic society when we avoid some of the problems of having an absolute ruler. Absolute ruler has a lot of downsides to it, even if an absolute ruler keeps order. And so we're able to have a very pluralistic, a much messier, in other words, society, one which is less well ordered. And
Hmm.
maybe fantasy is kind of extension of that. Maybe we're just that's just an extension of our untidiness of the world. Uh, I don't know, right? How far can one go? I think is a
Uh-huh.
question about that, and it's an issue I really want to explore this year in some of my
Yeah.
essays, because I think it really is it is brought up centrally by politics, by also by the way we talk about it. Of course, virtual reality is not only just is a term; it's a fact, right? It's people can live in a virtual world. Our technologists are trying to make it even easier to live in a more virtual world.
Hmm.
And what does that do when everyone lives in their own virtual world to the interactions between people in the real world is, I think, is a fascinating and perhaps unnerving question.
That's fascinating, but I guess to and this is my perspective, I suppose, but at some point you have to admit this is fantasy. I can interact with virtual reality. I can indulge in fantasy. I mean, this isn't new. Throughout the ages, we've had novels and things that allegory, things that are fictional in telling, but there was always a line in where we know this is where we depart from the truth. That
Right. Well,
the
but let me say that, and the reason there was a line, and it was reality really put a lot of pressure on people all the time. One of the things that strikes me, and I over the Christmas break, I've been my daughter's 5 years old, and we've been reading, to me, a fascinating book called "The Little House in the Big Woods" by Laura Ingalls Wilder, a famous book that maybe now under some pressure
right,
from me. But it's a fascinating book precisely because these are people on the frontier.
right,
Sure, they tell stories, but reality is all around them. They can't afford to
right.
live in a fantasy world. They live in a fantasy world. They'll be eaten by a bear.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a little different from our world. It's a world in which people are able to, I think, because of our great wealth, because of our great, at least so far, social great security,
Hmm.
people are able to, I think, indulge in fantasies and blur those lines in a way that they weren't on the frontier. So I think you have to think about the conditions of life and what that generates. And so I think our mix, our the growing power of fantasy in our world has to be connected to the tremendous leisure, the tremendous ease of modern society, which is only brought forcibly home when you
Hmm.
read something like The Little House in the Big Woods,
Right,
which is a world that, well, it's only 150 years ago, which is not
right.
very long in historical time. It's
Hmm.
just completely different. I mean, it's just not a surprise that we have our students at our universities seem to live, to me, a life of fantasy about the world.
Right.
They weren't brought up on the frontier. They were
Yeah.
brought up in a very wealthy, very coddled society, right? It's not surprising that you're going to get a very different society when the children have been brought up on the frontier from where the children are, how the children are brought up under the social conditions they're brought up today.
Well, I definitely believe there's an effect on how you view and approach things, by the conditions you were raised in. Absolutely. But we're not exactly without consequence, though, because like with this man's film, who killed Michael Brown? You said it was controversial with Amazon. Did they not allow him to run it or something?
They left, eventually allowed him to run it, but they first said, well, he couldn't run it. And then there was a
Right.
backlash. They did allow him to run it, became very popular But I think what's interesting is Amazon runs all sorts of things that are much more
Yeah.
fact-based than Who Killed Michael Brown, that have every reason to believe that are
Right.
actually untrue. And
Uh-huh.
the obvious reason that Amazon had difficulty running this was that the facts presented were at
Mhm.
variance with the myths about Michael Brown's death, and they
That's
thought it
right.
might not be good for business.
But and the reality is, though, you can only go into fantasy so long it's absolutely untrue before you see consequences.
That's
There,
right.
there,
And I think that
there,
we see that we saw that over the summer, and maybe that right reality will bite. To that's
yeah,
another word.
exactly.
So maybe we should have great confidence going forward. And I mean that's the hope, right? And the hope
Yeah,
that democracy is in that sense a kind of series of empirical experiments. And if an administration comes in and tries to do various things that are variance with the facts too much, it's going to be thrown out. And we'll see one interesting test of that will be to look at some of these mayors who presided over
yeah.
cities like Minneapolis,
Mhm.
Portland. What's going to happen to them? Because it's hard to believe that many of the citizens are happy with the degradation and increase in crime that have happened
Right.
there. And I think you might see a consequence at the ballot box. So let's hope that democracy is a real reality inducing system of government.
If they don't deal with those mayors, then they are still stuck in virtual reality. That's my opinion.
Well, I think that's fair.
Yes. John O. McGinnis, professor at constitutional law at Northwestern University and contributor to Law and Liberty Foundation. It's been a real pleasure having you on with us today.
Delighted to be here.
All
Thank
right,
you so much.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Welcome to the essay segment. John O. McGinnis wrote a really excellent article comparing those two films together, The Crown and What Killed Michael Brown, and the poetic truths that are trying to be, sewn in there or that are read between the lines or whatnot. It made me think a lot, especially with everything that I watch nowadays. I am utterly amazed. I really am. And maybe this is something you should think about yourself. Do this as a little experiment. I know I may appear crazy at times, but you can test the level of crazy by your own empirical observation. Watch the shows that are out there, and especially the ones that get all the publicity and are spread around and encouraged for you to watch. Just watch them and see if you don't see what I see. All the ideas are the same. They almost do not deviate to a fault. The plots are almost always the same. They never deviate. All of it has to deal with social justice. All of it has to deal with one group overcoming another. There's always going to be a feminist plug. There's always going to be a demonstration of homosexual love. There's always going to be the ridicule of Jesus, the church, or a conservative. And it's a continuous, mindless juggernaut that just continues on and on without any deviation. Now, think about this. In consideration of that, we have the ability to hear all kinds of voices in this nation. We have the media apparatuses in which to share information in a way we've never dreamed of in the history of man. And you mean to tell me that on all of these major things, there's no contrary idea? There's no other perspective that is being shared, just that one, as if the entire nation agrees with it, which is obvious that it does not. Why is that? That's really the question that should be asked. With all the abilities to communicate, how is it that one message gets like 90% of exposure and every other message gets maybe a mention if necessary, but usually as a means in which to ridicule it? Other than that, there's no real consideration of ideas whatsoever. There's no testing of ideas anymore. And that's really my point. When has our media our forms of entertainment become simply a means of propaganda and mind control. So that's really all it's come down to try to condition people to think, believe, and mainly to feel a certain way. And it's relentless. It's continuous. I cannot watch one simple show for some form of entertainment without being bombarded with these crazy leftist ideas. They're just constantly there, 24/7. I even watch shows I think surely they can't impugn this, they can't twist this, can they? And sure enough, there it is. That's why I'm still convinced there's one writer and everyone else has to print what they say. That's about what it is. Every article, every movie, whatnot. And look at articles. For example, take the, let me put this into quotation marks. This is the virtual quotation marks I'm putting upon this. Let's take the quote unquote insurrection that happened on 6 January, which, for the record, having personally fought against insurgents on numerous occasions, I want to say that was not an insurrection. And if you believe that, you're living in virtual reality. That's not an insurrection. If that was an insurrection, that many people showed up and they came armed, it would have been a different result. There would have been a lot more bloodshed and it would still be fighting. So, but anyway, let's start with the quote unquote insurrection that happened on January 6th, that supposedly the mastermind himself, Trump, with all that scary power, conjured up a mob to purposely assault the Capitol building, like he planned that or something, right? But that's what I get. I mean, every credible news source, and by that I mean the popular big name ones. I don't mean that as in I give them any credibility. But every quote unquote, there's a lot of quote unquotes here, a lot of virtual going on today. The credible sources, all the main sources, that'd be the safer way to go. They all literally pitch the same story. Every one of them. You mean to tell me that in this nation of millions of supposedly free thinkers, there's not one journalist that has a contrary opinion? They think exactly alike? Now, here's something you need to consider. And put this again, if you think I'm crazy, just search that topic alone, among other things. And what's going to be force-fed to you is going to be practically the same story over and over again without deviation. And it's the without deviation that should catch your attention. Because here's how it works. Take for example, that if a crime happened somewhere and you had some witnesses who saw it, now when an investigator comes and asks, hey, what happened? He wants to question those witnesses separate. Why? So they don't have time to inform each other of what they think happened. And if there are people in on it, he doesn't want them to have a chance in order to cook up a story between them. But you want to know how often a story, when you look at a story, if you know it's been cooked up or not? When you see it repeated almost verbatim from one mouth to the next as if it's the truth, and they just hit play when they're questioned and they give it. That is what makes things suspect. When I look at all these reports of the credible media sources, and they all echo the exact same phrases, the exact conclusions, there's not one deviating fact in which to look at, then you know what that spells? Collusion. Collusion. That means they got together ahead of time and concocted what they were going to say, and that's our story, we're sticking to it, and that's what they do. But then they're going to try to hide behind this notion of journalistic integrity, when really what it is editorial propaganda censorship. That's just the news articles and pieces that come out, the news on the videos, whether you read them on paper, read them online, you'll see that. Again, do the check yourself. Sure, I'm crazy, but test my crazy Read that stuff. They literally say the same thing, and they emphasize the key points about the racism. It was motivated by racism. Where they get their proof, what's their source, doesn't matter. You just restate what's being said, right? Trump instigated and told them to come there to storm the building. Okay, where's your proof? You ain't got it. It doesn't matter. You repeat it and you keep saying it and it becomes true. And I say this fully disappointed at the idiots who did storm the Capitol building. I mean, what did they think that was going to accomplish? That was a stupid move. That should not be tolerated. We watched it all year long in 2020 as leftists did this and totally destroyed city after city, while these same people who were screaming insurrection were cheering it on, calling it, peaceful protest, mostly peaceful protest, saying stupid stuff like violence is the language of the unheard, and taking knees in support of what's going on. Cities literally burned while they did that, and they're going to call what happened at Washington insurrection. Absolute lunacy. But do the test. See if you can detect the collusion the way that I see it. When people are saying exactly the same thing, and they're not going to deviate from the story, and they're not going to deviate from the facts, and it's just echoed material, that means there's collusion. That means there was a premeditation on how to put the story out there and how they wanted it to be received, which means you don't have all the truth. But we were talking mainly about shows. I mean, we know the news is a joke, but a lot of people watch these things and don't know what's happening. You haven't paid attention to what's going on yet, because there is an interesting mix of entertainment and propaganda. And that's strange, I gotta say that in the United States of America, but that's what we have, a mixture of entertainment and propaganda. See, they have some really catchy shows. And, it's a real joy to watch. It's entertaining and makes you laugh, makes you cry, makes you get into it. You want to see the next episode. But what do they slide into every show? Every show is untouched, right? You have to have a 110-pound woman in high heels kick 5 men's butt like every other episode, right? You have to. It's mandatory. It doesn't matter if it's realistic or not. She's strong and she can do it. You see on the show that she's constantly insecure, but she's not when she acts, sort of thing. I don't know. It's an old feminist playbook, still played over and over again, irregardless of reality. And it's just constantly run with, right? But you have to have that, right? You have to have the chauvinist pig that's fighting her. That's always mandatory. Saying things that, let's be honest, nobody's saying that stuff anymore. Hello, 1970s. Welcome back. We still talk that way? No, we don't. I don't witness all the things that they keep throwing out there. A lot of us don't. But what they do is they get you emotionally involved in this thing. Every show now, you have to have homosexual affairs, and it has to, not only is it like there, but it's like it gets like major coverage, and you have to applaud for it. And if there is a character that does not approve, oh, well, you definitely make it known that they are wrong in their disapproval. I find it crazy in this world of this incessant desire for tolerance and inclusion that they don't include actual Christian characters in these shows. Oh, no, don't get me wrong. They have quote unquote Christian characters that they put on these shows, but they're there sort of like the red shirts in Star Trek are. When you need somebody knocked off, you bring on a red shirt, right? Well, if you need someone to ridicule or someone to make look silly, or just have an extra and show how impotent the Christian faith it really is, we'll bring a Christian on and put them in there. I mean, I've actually seen, to my amazement, that they would include, scenes with there's pastors there. I was like, ooh, that's a change. What made them want to put a pastor on there? But then I watched as the pastor condoned sin. I watched as they were just like everybody else. And, their religion is basically something on the side. And that's how they go with it. And they basically present it like this. There's a nice form of Christian that leaves everybody alone and won't mention their God stuff, and it's on the side. And then you have the evil, mean Christians and pastors. So if we will tolerate you, you will behave not according to your religious faith, but to the way we tell you to act. That's insane. But I would like to see just an actual Christian character when they have their lovemaking scene that they have to have between two women or two men or however they want to roll with it. Pretty soon maybe it'll be children, who knows, right? And actually have a Christian literally just disapprove because of their faith. I mean, well, how would that episode would look like? Well, I'll tell you how it would probably roll. They would be made the villain. Again, test what I'm saying. If I'm crazy, whatever, test what I'm saying. Test the truth, not the messenger. Test the truth, right? They've been doing this for years. But what they do is they make a hero, or nowadays they make a heroine and emphasize the heroine over the hero, because men can't be heroes anymore. But you have the hero / heroine. But if there's a hero, he will, of course, acknowledge all the women around him that they're better than he is, sort of thing. But you have the hero, the heroine, and they'll have these certain ideas in their struggle, right? And what they do is they make this hero person, this hero figure, likable. They make them likable. So you kind of begin to identify with them, and you root for them, and you want them to succeed in what they're doing. And then you throw in the arch villain. And of course, the arch villain is the very opposite of what that heroine or that hero believes. And basically everything you want to ridicule, they just put into the villain. Everything you want to espouse and glorify, you put into the hero. And guess who wins? The hero. Guess who looks like the loser jerk? The villain. They get you to love the one person. And so it's sort of like this. Well, they're kind of all right. They're cool. I like them. They think this, but, they're cool people. I guess it's okay. And then the villain comes along to fight them. It's like, yeah, I hate that person. And, oh, they're against that. And see, they do this little mind trick on you. They get you to like things that if you considered it for its own merit without a fantasy story to explain it, you probably wouldn't go for it. Not at all. But I've come to learn that almost all villains are scarecrows. And by that, I'm talking about the logical fallacy, where you build up a person to be something they're not in order to criticize them. So you you're this and this and this and this and this, and then you launch an attack at those things, which are considered evil, and thus you beat up that person, but it's just a scarecrow. Well, that's what they do in these shows. A lot of these villains are just hugely crafted scarecrows of all things that they want to rage against. But who's like that? Who are these people that you're raging against like that, right? And this is why I fear every remake of every movie and every series that's ever been done, because I know what they're going to try to do with it. It could have even been something that would have been against their current values. And basically, they're going to steal its ethos and its popularity, remold it into their image, and then, use it as a form of propaganda to, put out there what they want to convince you with. And then they dominate the whole industry. I do not live in the land of the free, where an entire industry takes it upon themselves to propagandize an entire free citizenry and repress any other competitor. I refuse to acknowledge that as the land of the free, and I'm against that stuff. As far as I'm concerned, those companies need to be busted up. They need to be hemmed in. They need to be defunded. We need to quit supporting them with our funds. We need to find alternative sources and get it legitimate coverage. That's the only way it's going to work. And don't let them steal it this time, because that's how they operate. They find things that are built that someone else built. They infiltrate it, they take it, and then they begin from the top down, force their view using that and its prestige that it gained that they didn't, to use it as a vehicle for persuasion. We need to build newer stuff, better stuff, and don't let them steal it anymore.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.